Okay, so let's do another grid. We're going to do this one down here, a little more complex than the earlier grid. To do this grid though, I want to make sure that you've thoroughly read the W3 Schools pages that are assigned up here, specifically the grid item page. If you haven't done so, go back, click on this link, make sure that you've gone through all the terms and the information first. Okay? When you click on it, you're going to come to this page, grid item right here. And I'm kind of replicating this grid, this top one. It's not exact. The layout's a little bit different, but that's sort of what we're using as the basis for the lesson. So if I look at that example and I look at the items that are in here, all of the code, that's really important to understand while we're doing this video lesson. Of course, you're not going to understand everything in advance, but what's really going to be helpful is just to go through, start at the top, do the try it, go down, read everything, grid column property, read all of this information so that it is a little bit familiar and you can go back and find everything, as we're going through the video lesson, should you need to do so. Okay, let's go ahead and start this. Create a div. I'm going to name it grid container. I could call it grid parent. I could just call it container parent. I could call it a lot of different things. I'm going to call it grid container so that it matches what W3 Schools has done. And inside of the container, I need some items. Div item. Oops. Have to give it a name with the class. Okay, div class grid item. We're going to add more to this in a little bit to this class, but for now, I'm going to keep it simple and just start like this. Call it 1. Okay, so those are the exact same classes, so I'm just going to duplicate them now. Come down here, there's 3, 4, and we've got 5 total. 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so 5, and that's because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here. All of these 5 items have some things in common. They have the same background color, they have the same padding. So that's why I'm going to start with the class and with styling a selector that has the same rules. Okay, over here, I'm going to do the container first. Display has to be set to grid. Background color. Let's just choose something here. That's fine. Padding, we always need padding to help out with the space between all of the items. Actually, that's the grid gap. The padding's going to help keep things from butting up next to edges. So let's do pixels and grid gap. Remember that from our last lesson. Grid gap creates the space between the items. It's this space in here, the darker gray. Okay, so we've got a little bit of work to do. So we have a grid, everything's just stacked on top of each other right now until we do something with this. Next, I'm going to style this grid item. Background color. It's probably going to be really hard to look at. I'll change it if I need to. Text align center. So the numbers all are centered within their columns. Padding. So we always like a little bit of space. I'll start with that. That is kind of painful to look at. I'm going to change these purple areas maybe to white. And this aqua color, I'll make it a little bit aquamarine. I'll make it a little bit darker so that it's easier to see. Okay. In another lesson, in a past lesson, we actually added up here to the top auto, 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 and that allowed our columns just to be able to be spaced out evenly. That's what we used for this guy up here. We can't do that because this one is set up a little bit differently. So this time we're going to use separate grid item selectors to set up widths and heights. If I go back to my HTML, so div class grid item, and this is the first one. I'm going to make this, I'm going to add another selector to it, item 1. And I'm going to do that for each of these classes. Item 2, for each of these elements. Item 3, space, item 4, no space between the item and the number 4, but a space between the different selectors. Okay. What this means is that this guy up here is going to be using the selector grid item, and it's also going to be looking for item 1. Okay, let's go back to CSS. Item 1. Remember, no space in here. You've got to make sure it's typed correctly or it won't work. And I'm going to use grid column and grid rows to set this up. Grid column. And I want to start my column right here. So this is the item I'm working with. It's going to start in the first column and in the first row. And how many are there overall? Overall, we've got 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3 rows. Okay, so column 1, row 1. So grid column 1, and I'm spanning 1 column. So by span, I mean if I've got 3 columns here, here's column 1, it's just spanning 1 column. If I look over here at 2 though, it's spanning 2 columns. So I'm going to indicate that in my CSS. So column 1 is spanning 1 column, but it's spanning 2 rows. So grid row is starting at 1 and it's spanning 2. Item 2 the column is starting at 2 and it's spanning 2 columns. The row, on the other hand, is starting at 1 and it's only spanning 1, so I don't need to actually put in the term span. Item 3 grid column. The column is starting at 2. And it's only spanning 1, so I don't need to indicate that part of it. That's default. The row is also starting at 2. And it's only 1 row, so leave that. Item 4. Column starts in the 3rd spot. And the row starts in the 2nd spot. Down to item 5. The column starts in the 1st spot. Okay, so here's the 1st spot. And it spans 3 columns. The row starts in the 3rd spot. It doesn't span any additional rows, just 1. So if I have typed this in correctly, this will sort of look like this one. Oops, look what I've done. Item 3, item 4, item 5. You see how these are different from each other? I forgot, and I put the spaces in between the words item and the number, and of course that's wrong. Okay, that looks a little better. Get everything typed in correctly or it won't work. And when I save everything, there we go. Okay, that's it for this grid lesson.